you are. So this is Paula Ciccarelli. Are you still teaching third grade?
Yes.
Cool. So she is a third grade teacher, and we'll leave like other details anonymous so we don't get her in any trouble. But she was actually the last classroom I worked in before I got my teaching license. So she and I go way back, super cool teacher, and she has a really kind of quirky last name. So I had a nickname for her, Mississippi, because it had a lot of consonants in her last name. So, but I didn't know the chicken nugget thing. That's cute.
Yeah, that's pretty new. But we made a great team. I miss you.
Yeah, I miss you too. I miss that whole year a lot. That was a lot of fun. So, and we had an interesting class that year. There's a lot of behavior in your class. And so Paula, this is Katie Lyford. She's one of the behavior specialists with the company. And I think you already know Ted Hoke. So I shared our YouTube channel with Paula. Yeah. And she sends me a message and was like, "These are great." And I just love Ted.
Everyone does.
It's true. Very entertaining.
Ted gets a cult following. So I thought it would be cool to bring on Paula because she is a general education teacher, and we talk so much about special education. And we were talking this week about a teacher's perspective of behavior. So I thought it would be interesting just to yank in a gen ed teacher and put her on the spot and ask her, what's the first thing that comes to your head when you think of behavior in your classroom?
I think of bad behavior. I think of behavior modification models.
Yeah. So what do you do about behavior?
Well, I still feel like I have a lot to learn. This past year, I worked with the special ed teacher was actually in my classroom for most of the day. I learned a lot from her this year, but usually use a clip system. Well, last year we were given a clip system to use across the board for all the classrooms. And at first I was like, I've never really used one before, but I'll try it, I have to. But I do kind of like, so if you're showing some good positive behavior, you were told you can go clip up and then you can get up, you have that movement, you have that feeling good. But then if you're showing bad behavior, you have to clip down. But you do have the chance to clip back up. So you can kind of modify what you're doing and, do better. But anyway, at the end of the day, if you have moved up off of green, we do a clap out. So we say everyone's names and we give them a clap clap. So that kind of makes them feel good. I really try to make sure that I don't have too many left down at the bottom of the clipboard, but if they are, then they have to get a call home talking about their behavior. So that's kind of like the positive and the negative of it. And the other thing I do like about it, I'm not saying I love it, but I like that immediate, like go clip down, they get up, they have to do something and either clip down, clip up, but I like that they have the choice that they can clip back up again. Yeah. And I also, before that, I used something called a sweet seat. So I have this great fun chair that they can sit in at their desk. And I would just give out, anytime I saw good behavior, I would give out just tickets and they would just put their initial on it and put it in the bucket. And at the end of the day, pick one name out, free, don't have to buy anything. And then they're my friend who gets the sweet seat for the next day.
Gotcha. So it's funny because we kind of went off, Ted, I don't know if you watched the broadcast on Tuesday, we kind of went off on a rant on positive behavior intervention systems, and just how that one size model doesn't always fit all. But Katie, I know one of the things that we always, and we talked about it a lot on Tuesday, was that behavior is everything, right? I think Kate needs to be promoted.
Yeah.
So
she's got here. I got you.
Why, Paula? Do you ever think of like doing math as a behavior, or reading as a behavior, or just teaching in general? Do you kind of lump that into behavior?
Yeah, it's funny because I honestly, I'll tell you honestly, I don't when I'm in the classroom. I just think of more like, are you doing what you're supposed to be doing?
Well, yeah. So Ted, I think like one of the things I wanted to have a conversation about was how do we kind of shift that mindset of only thinking about having teachers' perspective of behavior being that like maladaptive behavior and shift it to understanding that it's everything.
Well, a couple things. One, let me bring up again one of my favorite books, Controversial Therapies for Autism and Intellectual Disabilities. There's a very nice chapter in here on positive behavior support, a paternalistic utopian delusion. What people don't realize is that PBS grew out of and was a rejection of applied behavior analysis and touted itself as a new science in the early 90s. Well, new sciences are rare because, you know, it means that like there's been a whole set of laws of nature that have been discovered and are being researched. Well, there aren't any new laws of nature in PBS. So it's a movement at best, but it's not that. But, you know, a lot of it comes from how teachers are trained. There are, in teacher training programs, and again, I'm employed by a university, and I'm in the College of Education, and there's very little of anything having to do with behavior in that. There is a classroom management course that all teacher ed candidates have to take, and that deals with how to do an FBA, really watered down because you have to cover everything in one course, and how to handle bad behavior. And teachers never, ever, ever get, at least from that program, the notion that behavior is anything a person says, does, thinks, or feels. Now, when that's how you approach behavior, anything a person says, does, thinks, or feels, that opens the world wide up. And there is actually a science, a natural science, that examines laws of nature that govern behavior. And when you learn about that, you can really do a tremendously better job with your instructional design, with your delivery of instruction, with everything. And then you take, you know, how to teach reading and reading itself, how to teach math, math itself, you know, PE, you take everything. I won't say a lot more seriously, but you take it from a different perspective that lets you look at each thing the student is supposed to learn, and it gives the teacher more responsibility for arranging the conditions for the student to learn it. And then what Paula, that's your name, right? Not Nugget
Yes.
Master. What Paula
we
mentioned
can go with
earlier,
Nugget Master. That works
yeah,
too.
what Nugget was describing earlier was a system by which a call goes home when there's bad behavior. Well, what if it was kids who behaved well during the day, the whole day, or better than yesterday? What if you can't give them all a call home because you'll be on the phone all evening if things go well? But what you can do is let them all have a note to take home, and you randomly make calls from among that pool. So you do a few calls a day. Imagine what would happen if the consequence is a happy one and not a, you know, your son's being a knucklehead, you know, do what you will with him, not that kind of call. Imagine what that might do to motivate the students to work harder and do better every day.
I did that actually a lot. I knew that some of my students had like special evenings with their parents, or, you know, like Dad's Day or something like that. And so I would intermittently call my students' parents, not, you know, the same day every week, but, you know, every 2 or 3 weeks, you know, or whatnot. And at the end of the day, I was like, oh my gosh, Katie. And they're like, what? Like, they're thinking like, what'd I do? And I was like, you've had a fantastic day. I think before we jump on the bus, let's give Mom a call. And she's like, okay, like, let's call Mom. And I'm like, yeah. And so like, they know that like, oh my gosh, as soon as I get on this bus, Mom's going to be there to pick me off the bus. And it's just gonna be super awesome because I just called her. Like, that was something that I really enjoyed doing. And the parents were always, you know, with us being in special ed, oftentimes they get the negative calls a lot. And so getting to call, so like when I would call, they'd be like, what's wrong? And I was like, actually nothing's wrong. Like, and it wasn't even just for having good days. It was for us getting a 75 on a spelling test, because that was a huge gain. And I just was like, oh, nothing's wrong. They're actually having a fantastic day in class. I just wanted to let you know that we took a spelling test and we got a 75. And the kids are like, hey mom, I got a 75. And they're like, yay. So it's like, that was something I did, just like quick moments, you know, it wasn't gonna be a long conversation, and I made sure that we did it for little things too. Just, you know, a spelling test or.
Imagine what that does for relations with a parent. Cause you're right.
Oh yeah.
A lot of times the only time they get the call is when there's a problem. What if they get calls? What if 19 times out of 20, when they get the call, it's something good?
Yeah.
And only rarely do they get the call about, listen, I need your help with this.
Right.
You know?
Yep. Well, and it's not that phone call, you know, the obligatory phone call at the beginning of the school year or in January. Like, I made sure that I called parents on a regular basis, so they didn't forget that I was their special ed teacher, that I was their students' case manager, so that if things were coming up, I was available for them as well. So you're right. I've actually had very good success with just parent relationships, I think, because I built that rapport with them early on.
Yeah.
So.
Hey, Kate, I just want to, you jumped on just a little bit late. I wanted to introduce you to Paula Ciccarelli. So
Hello,
she's
Nugget
a
Master.
third grade teacher.
Good morning.
Yes.
And
My name is Director of Joy, so.
Yes.
Again.
Could I mention?
My last year as an instructional assistant, and SPED was in her class. So
Cool.
she's a pretty cool lady. I actually hadn't seen her in a long, long time. So this is kind of a fun little catch up here. But so I think that's like looking at the origins. Ted mentioned that he works out of the College of Education. But when I think back to like my coursework for education, Katie, your bachelor's was in psychology. So, but Kate, you did educational coursework, right?
I was a psych major.
She was psych, yeah.
I only took I took 2 education courses in my undergrad.
Yeah, you hired a ton of psychology majors.
But I got my master's in education, yes.
You got your master's in education. And then Paula, did you do your undergrad or your master's in education?
Undergrad.
Did you, I mean, I don't remember ever talking about behavior like Ted said in my course sequence. I mean, it wasn't really, I remember classroom management.
No.
Yeah, yes, exactly. And this last year when I had a special ed teacher in there with me, it was amazing to actually have a model to watch and learn from. I'm like, wow, I've learned so much this year, you know, on how to help these students that need their help.
I know that like for my master's course, my coursework, the big thing that we focused on that I can honestly remember is it was like, you know, it was relationship. That was the key, you know, just understanding relationship. And I think like that's the big thing that's focused on. But I made that shift. So I was invited to do an adjunct professor position for a semester, and I got to teach an undergrad special ed course, just introductory. And I remember saying to the students, and I talked to like, of course, you know, the head of the department about it, but I was like, I can tell you about a lot of different disabilities. We can all read the textbook and understand it, you know, but it's there for you to read. There's a lot of things on the internet too. Would you guys prefer to know a little bit of behavior background embedded with it? And they're like, yes, please. And it was great too, because a lot of those students were gen ed teachers. So I actually only had one future educator in there for special ed. And it's awesome. Like I know Brian now has gone and worked with several of those people in their classrooms, which is cool. And they're like, they often, he told me, and then other people, those students have emailed me back saying like, so this happened and I was able to tell them the function of the behavior. Like I knew why this was happening. I was like, that's fantastic. Because that's not taught. It's not taught.
And could I say something there? That's still, and that's good. And that's valuable. And that's still classroom management type stuff, right?
Yeah.
What I love is people who actually understand that teaching is changing behavior, that reading's behavior, that thinking's behavior, that speaking's behavior, that doing math and behavior is behavior. All that's behavior. Everything we do in school is behavior. And if we approach teaching academics the way we approach increasing probability of other behavior, things move along so much more quickly. I do, in my practice, I do a little bit of academic remediation. It's not uncommon that I could get a kid from first grade math to sixth grade math over the course of a summer. So I've been at it for a couple weeks with one of my kids. We're going to finish up first grade math tomorrow. We start second grade math next week. I think 2 or 3 weeks we're going to whip through that. And all it is, and it's not a bunch of discrete trial. Nothing could be more boring than that.
Yeah.
But all it is examining the behaviors we want, the conditions under which we need to get them, and teaching the kid to do that under those circumstances and reinforcing the dickens out of it. And then teaching it to fluency. So it sticks with it.
Yeah, and I've had that same experience with reading, especially. Katie, one of the little guys we work with, when we do apply that behavioral approach to the instruction, the growth that we've gotten within reading has been substantial. And it kind of baffles me that we move away from that known science and the instructional model. So Paul, I guess a question I have for you is like, why do you think, and I don't want to put you too much on the spot, but why do you think that teachers associate behavior only to things that are bad?
Well, that's a very good question.
Did I freeze?
I don't know.
I have an answer. I'll help
I
you
do
out.
not know.
Nugget Master, can I help?
Please.
I think the reason why we associate behavior with bad is because it takes away from the academics. So like teachers, we have, and I feel like I can say we, because, former teacher, still a teacher, I feel like at heart. So, we would create these lesson plans. They would meet the expectations. We spent hours on them, hours prepping the work. And then we're starting to do it. And it's because of the behaviors, we aren't able to complete the tasks that we planned. When planning for it, because we're not really taught it, with lesson planning is, how is this motivating? Like, what's the motivating operation? How are we going to be providing reinforcement to increase us wanting to complete this activity? And so I think that's why we associate behavior as bad, because it's taking away from the academics.
I totally agree with that. Yes.
Well,
yeah.
And all other things being equal, I would imagine that the bulk of the misbehavior, if you want to call it that, is coming from kids who are not the high academic achievers. And when we don't consider our instructional procedures themselves as behavior management, because it kind of is, and we don't consider the possibility that maybe part of the reason why these kids are not the highest academic achievers is because these particular procedures are not the most suitable for them, then we don't adjust that stuff. And what we get is, some say the kid's behavior is getting in the way of his learning the curriculum, but sometimes the manner of the instruction itself is leading to error, failure. A lot of these kids learn early on, errors are bad, getting it wrong is bad, and when you experience enough no, you have behavior problems. So I think it's just as likely that instruction that's not quite suitable for this learner leads to behavior problems, as it is behavior problems lead to the learner not accessing the curriculum.
And I think maybe to kind of like touch on that, Ted, like, again, schedules of reinforcement aren't taught. And so typically when we develop the schedule for the classroom, it's like, if we're doing stations, 15-minute stations here, 15 minutes here, 15 minutes here, we have to meet these 15 minutes. It's like, within the VDOE, correct me if I'm wrong, they require a certain number of hours for language arts instruction, a certain number of hours for math and whatnot. And so I would oftentimes get called in when working with a student, and they're like, they won't complete the task. They won't do this. And I'm like, yeah, because 15 minutes is way too long. And they're like, well, what are you doing? I was like, 5 minutes tops. And they're like, but I have to keep working. I was like, okay, but this activity is super boring for 15 minutes.
Yeah, well, and then the off chance that schedules of reinforcement are taught.
Yeah.
Very often.
From Dr. Ted Hope.
From Ted, yes.
Because they're You know, it's like very perfunctory, very obligatory. You learn the FIVI, FRVR,
Yes.
and that's all. And it's never put into context. And you're never shown which ones produce which kinds of performance, other than you're shown a cumulative graph that shows, you know, scalloping and stair steps and high smooth
Yep.
line and lower smooth line. It's never made real. You're never shown what the value is to knowing this. So again, this comes back to teacher preparation, but that's also a lot of behavior analysis training programs too.
It is.
Don't make that real. And it's going on around us all day, every day. Not to mention the concurrent schedules, not to mention availability of multiple schedules of reinforcement at any one time.
Yeah.
So there you go.
Yeah,
And transition problems. I'll shut up after this.
me too.
And transition problems as competing schedules of reinforcement. I can go from the easy to do fun thing that produces a ton of reinforcement, or I can sit and do my damn math. Who in their right mind wants to do that?
Right.
Yeah.
Hey, what were you gonna say?
Oh, just the main point, honestly. And we touched on this last week, and Ted reiterated it a little bit ago. If we look at everything as behavior, if we're teaching and we're sitting down and we're making our lesson plans and we're thinking this skill that we're targeting, this lesson plan that's, you know, aligns to whatever SOL goal or whatever state you're in, whatever your state test is, if we're thinking of all those things as behaviors, then it's easier to think about what are the reinforcement schedules and how are we setting the kids up for success? What are those antecedent-based interventions we're putting in place embedded into our lesson plans? Because in that way, we're not thinking about behavior in the bad way. The behaviors are also the academic skills. And so that's going to ultimately reduce behavior, bad behavior, like maladaptive behaviors that we don't want to see. Just because we are thinking about it in a way that makes more sense and that sets us all up for success. And then that's reinforcing to us. And so it's this perspective shift. And I think that, you know, we can't change this right now, but it'd be great if more behavioral stuff in more behavioral courses embedded into like teaching degrees would obviously help this, because teachers aren't coming out of school with knowing reinforcement schedules or knowing antecedent-based interventions. They might be doing them, but they don't know the science behind it. And if you give them that knowledge, like light bulbs go off and, you know, things start to come together. And so
I think of my first year, like I think baby Miss Hazel, a first year teacher, even second.
Because you're so old.
that's so cute.
And I just am like, geez, I wish I did this differently. Or like, gosh, I wish when I like went in and did push-in services with this gen ed teacher, like I wish we could have done this differently. Like, and we would have had like, hopefully more success. Like I think of the whole generalization where, you know, I had a lot of the work where, you know, I was teaching the kids to not only sit, but also work at the same time, because I was including motivating operations, not knowing it, but then I'd walk into the classroom and it wasn't until I came into the classroom that they'd be like, and I just like gave them that Miss Hazelwood look, and they're like, I'm going to sit down. It's like, I think that's a good choice. That's a very good choice.
Yeah, there's so many things that like I think back on. I wish I knew then what I know now.
Every
There was a
day.
kid,
Every day.
I still have this heartstring moment, and that it goes back to a kid that was in a class that Paul and I were working in together. Really tall young man that really struggled with multiplication, and I just remember bringing him to tears trying to get him to learn his times tables because and he was just one of those kids that fell between the lines. He didn't qualify for an IEP, you know, mainly because of his adaptive scores, but because we had to go through this direction of instruction, it just was so difficult. And if I knew then what I know now, the fun he could have learning that and the different modalities that I could use to teach that. But I still think back on that kid. Anytime I'm interacting with, I'll never forget that moment, taking an approved way of teaching math and just bringing a kid to tears doing it. And it's something that stuck with me for a long time. And whenever I interact with a new kid, I'm always kind of recycling that back in my head, because I'll never forget that expression. And it kind of goes back to what Ted said. I mean, if you just, and this kid was not by any stretch of the means of behavior. I think that the target behavior for him was just finding success, finding ways for him to be successful and acquire that academic knowledge a bit better. But he was one of those kids that just encountered failure after failure after failure, because we didn't approach it from a behavioral standpoint. And we stuck with that normal kind of even special education model of instruction. But Paul, one of the things I was kind of curious to get your perspective on, because we talked on Tuesday about kind of shifting this direction towards IEPs and with maintaining all confidentiality and stuff. Do you have or have you had IEP goals that were behaviorally, quote unquote, behaviorally based goals of students in your classrooms?
Well, sure. A type would be sitting and completing an activity, maybe like for 10 minutes at a time, something like that.
And do you find that you have much of a voice in the development of that as a teacher?
Well, I was not in the meeting when the IEP was created. So if I was in the meeting at the time, maybe the year before, then yes.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Yeah.
I was thinking something else. So I'm glad you clarified.
Yeah. IDEA
like-
be damned. Yeah.
I was like,
Yeah, I was like,
"Uh-oh,
okay.
Paula."
We don't need laws.
Someone forgot that meeting notice.
So
Not
I think
you,
it goes
someone
back
else.
to, yeah. I think it goes back to anything that, again, like Ted said, Katie said it very eloquently, that if a kid is doing something that we don't want them to do, most likely they're not doing something that we do want them to do. And the shift is just focusing on that thing that we do want them doing. And that needs to be the perspective of the IEP, the perspective of the instruction. So if a kid's out of their seat and roaming around, what is the solution? Well, the solution is to have them engaged in something. And how do we use kind of that behavioral principle to get them engaged with that? So
And then we need to look at, I'm sorry, Katie, go ahead.
It's okay. I'm sorry. It's hard. Just touching on differentiation, that's a word that every teacher hears, sees, knows, and has to attend to, right? So if we think about everything as a behavior and we don't separate it in our minds, in our IEPs, it's built in. Differentiation is changing up your schedules of reinforcement. Differentiation can be differential reinforcement and things like that. So
It is. But taken to the extreme, when we expect the teacher to have individualized instruction for every single student, now in a special ed classroom is supposed to, right? Which is why ratios are generally, more favorable, like fewer students and more
it's
instruction.
still a lot. Yeah.
But could you imagine if you have 20 students and you have to differentiate instruction for each and every one?
Yeah.
Which is why students are generally grouped together in terms of similar capabilities and stuff, because the fact is most things work for most people. And so we'll handle as many as we can this way, and we'll do the differentiation where we need to make sure that those who need it get it. But I think a really unfair burden is placed on some teachers because they're just the way that students are assigned to classes. They're given classes that require a whole lot of differentiation,
Right.
and they're not given many resources.
Yeah, I think grouping, like you said, makes the most sense. But yeah, I think that happens a whole lot. And the lack of training. They don't know how to differentiate for those behaviors, or how to group based on levels of, their functional level in terms of what they can do.
Well, and again,
There's
the
only
different,
so many hours in a day.
Yeah.
Paula, like about in a typical work week in your life as a teacher, about how many hours do you actually work? It's just 40, right? In and out. You do your school and you're done.
only 40.
Oh yeah.
38.
Yeah, like
Come
maybe.
on.
Yeah, constantly. I mean, even when you're in bed at night, you're working in your head.
Yeah.
You're
Oh my gosh.
thinking, I'm always thinking, how can I do this better? How can I help this
Sure.
child?
It's a personality thing too. Like,
Yes.
it's
The
like
overwhelming
why?
majority of teachers are very caring teachers who care about each and every one of their students. And so that's why you're always thinking about it, right? And
Yes.
then it's not a burden. You'd welcome each of the students, but to assign a bunch of people who each need very individualized instruction makes the job kind of difficult for you.
I don't know if any of y'all, like, my best thoughts come to me in the shower. And so, like, I would always be like, as I'm like, you know, rushing to get to work, and I'm like, oh, but I got to write down this really good idea. Like, this is how I'm going to teach it. And I'm like running around in
Of
a
course, the
towel, and I'm
paper's
like
all wet. And the ink's
writing
running.
down. Yeah, no. And I like have to, I'm like, okay, got to put this in my, like, I carry it with me. So like, okay, got to put this in my pant pocket so I don't forget it. Like, you're constantly working. But I think to go back to your differentiation, differentiation is like, there's a lot of ways to differentiate.
Yeah, it's vague.
But unfortunately, I really only see differentiation through task.
Yep.
Like how to complete a task.
Right.
Or like the assessments. That's where I see differentiation. I don't see, you know, or you know, how we're going to group the kids. But
yeah, I don't think it's adequately like trained or brought up in, you know, in trainings or in school for teachers. That I think differentiation is probably kind of, I would assume, gone over pretty fast in terms of tasks instead of thinking about it more behaviorally. So.
Or it's
Well, and I think in the current,
go ahead.
In the current model with the shift kind of to online learning too, I think that's really standing out, and people are kind of seeing that because when it does become this individual child trying to learn something, it has to be, you really see the level of differentiation that's needed and how specific it is to each child. And I do want to give a little shout out to Paula. She's one of the best gen ed teachers I've ever seen with differentiation. But do you think that, I mean, what Kate was saying, I think that's true, that what you see mostly in differentiation is the task and not the instruction model. Would you agree with that, Paula?
Explain that question to me one more time. The last part.
So when we think about differentiation, it, you know, and you come from that the voice, choice, pace, place, or kind of model. We think about it in terms of, I think about it in terms of instruction, but I think how it manifests itself in the classroom is usually just in modification of the task.
Can I give an example just for clarifying anybody else out there, Paula? So I think of it like the addition, like just pretty simple addition, right? Like, you know, people may accommodate with the use of graph paper, right, to help with the alignment of numbers. But what I think, Chad, you're still saying is like, we're still teaching kids how to add, you know, you go from top to bottom. It's the same thing. The only difference is with one group, we may give them graph paper, and the other group, they get to freely write it on a whiteboard.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think during my small groups with the differentiation, I would also, with, you know, children that are having a harder time, I would keep it more simple and, you know, more of a step-by-step, whereas the next group might already have mastered that. So we're going on to the next, you know, the next part of that. So that's kind of in there too. That's in my mind when I'm trying to plan.
Yep.
Right, so they would retrain, if you're breaking something up like that into shorter pieces, they would be reaching reinforcement on a thicker schedule. So it is happening, and yeah, it's just how you're thinking about it. So that's, I think, giving teachers the knowledge of like, you are doing these things, you're thinking correctly, your instincts are spot on, but here's what it's called, and here's how you can explain it, and here's how you can help other teachers do it well.
But I think too, where Chad, you're talking about the instructional piece, it goes back to like, I mean, I've worked with a lot of kids that did not have number. They didn't have number understand. Like, they didn't understand numbers.
Yeah.
They didn't have that one-to-one correspondence. And so it's like, but, we're going to teach addition, and we're going to go up to 10 because that's what the VDOE says we need to do. So are you talking about maybe that differentiation piece? Like, you know, this group, we're not ready to do adding yet. We need to have that one-to-one correspondence.
Could I share something?
Exactly. Ted's been raising his hand. So
I know.
let's-
Sorry,
I
Ted.
want to share my screen for a moment. And this is something I brought up before. Here, share that. Okay, do you see this again? Do you see this?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. This is from the precision teaching literature. And this is a table of what is called learning channels, not like the one that Honey Boo Boo was on TV, but you know what this is consider this axis the manner in which the student experiences the task. And this is the manner in which the student needs to respond to the task. Now, first off, most things really, we talked last week about multisensory instruction.
Mhm.
And I think the reason why that works when it does is because it's doing this. It's teaching across task modalities and response modalities. Most of the things we do, we need to be able to do when the task is presented a bunch of different ways and when the response occurs a bunch of different ways. Like, think about simple addition. I need to be able to add stuff when I hear it, when I see it, when it's in numbers, when it's in things, when I'm feeling in my briefcase, reaching around to make sure I have all the things I'm looking for and I don't see it. There's a lot, I don't know about taste and sniff, but there's a lot of different ways that I need to be able to do it and experience the task. But I also need to be able to actually produce the right number of things, draw them. I don't know about emoting math, but choose the right answer, match, say the right answer, select the right answer. If it's on an iPad, tap out the right answer, think the right answer. If it's in an intermediate step of something that then uses that, write the right answer. There's a lot of different ways it needs to be done. And you were bringing up, Kate, you brought up the whole numeracy thing, understanding, that 4 is 4.
Mhm.
Well, if you're just taught with, numeral 4, and then 4 ladybugs, 3 ladybugs, 2 ladybugs, circle 4, there's a lot of different ways that can be taught.
It came.
And especially early on, but then later on, stuff needs to be done across learning channels
Mhm.
because some may be stronger, some may be weaker. And I am not at all a proponent of this styles of learning thing. I think the myth that there are visual learners and auditory learners and all of that is just that, a myth. What it is, and so universal design is wonderful when it's like cutouts for wheelchair accessibility and stuff. But when it comes to, I have to present everything auditorily, no, because that does nothing to help the child learn how to read. And the whole rest of the world doesn't know that they have to do that. But
Exactly. Yeah.
what this does, when we plan instruction this way and differentiate this way, what it does is kind of like take the weaker reading skills out of the math so that the kid can learn the math with numbers, with symbols, with tangible things, with a whole lot of other things, while reading is also being worked on. So I'll be quiet there. But this is, if you want to find this, Google Precision Teaching Learning Channels and just poke around until you find this. And this is, when I'm designing my graduate courses, I use this because I have to teach what I'm teaching, for students to be able to do a bunch of different ways.
I love these chats because every time I always learn something from Ted. I've never actually seen that sheet, and I think that's
Well, if you were here
That's
last week,
awesome.
you would have. Just saying.
well. I was
The week before, yeah.
desert camping. We are on our way.
Travel
back.
master.
I'm in Nebraska, and I still have yet to see a stalk of corn. Just
Gross.
complete false advertising.
A what?
A stalk of corn. I
thought you
we're
said
in Nebraska.
stalk,
And I haven't seen any corn yet.
something that rhymes with corn. Okay, never mind.
Oh no. This is why I select not suitable for children on the YouTube channel.
Yeah.
But no, the precision teaching thing, I think a couple things I bumped on there, Ted, was the precision teaching is working towards fluency. And I think whenever
Yes.
you are doing it across those modalities and what you said, well, while some people might acquire some information better auditorily or visually, I definitely don't have the credentials Ted does to say that with such confidence. But life doesn't work that way. You might get a job where they're not going to provide that option of learning style for you. So you really do have to become fluent in all learning styles, and this mindset that we're only going to teach one way because that's the one way that student gains knowledge. That might be where we start, but we've got to build them to where they can acquire the information and be fluent with the information and the task.
And the big fancy
different
word
ways.
Chad's
So I
looking
think
for is generalization. We
Yes.
have to generalize
Generalization.
it from
Yeah,
place to
I've been on
place.
vacation too long. My brain is starting to.
And we touched on that
like
a little
melt.
bit
Yeah.
on was it Tuesday?
Yeah.
Days.
I just think,
They also have to run together.
I just know we've talked about it before. And so
Mhm.
I like that, Chad, you gave such a great example of like, you know, in the workforce, this specific way of teaching may not be there. So we have to generalize multiple ways of learning it.
Mhm.
And at the
Yeah.
same time, we have to look at the possibility that those modalities that are weaker are not because of something having to do with the learner, like somehow biologically, genetically, he's not able to read. No. What if it's just we need to teach it differently? What if it's we need to do a lot of remediation, teaching, establishing fluency before we move on, rather than moving the kid on because it's time to move on.
Yep.
Yeah.
You know, then we can help the kid catch up. Again, this is what I do with the academic remediation I do. Someone else is working on reading fluency while I'm working on the math stuff. The kid's behavior and mental health is improving as we go along. And it's very much a win-win. But there again, the emphasis is on building fluency before moving on, looking at the academics, doing academics as behavior, and building the instruction that way.
Mhm.
Ted, quick
So-
question. Is there any way that like I could observe? I just like want to learn from you. Just like, I want to watch Ted.
I know, I'm sure it's-
I know probably not. I know probably not, but I'm just like, you keep mentioning it. I was like, I want to see him take this kid from 1st to 6th grade.
Right?
I
Is there
wanna
something
see
we can
this.
sign?
Teach us your ways, Ted. Teach us your ways.
So to put
Need to
Paul on the
watch
spot
him.
one more time. Yeah. Do you ever consider what a student's motivation is when they sit down to do a task? Like, does that ever factor into your lesson planning or your instructional mindset?
Well, I like to think that they're there to learn from me. You know, I try and understand where they're coming from, and I try to understand their background, and you know, try and teach it and understand it them as they're coming to sit down and you know, do a task or learn a task. I don't know if that answers your question.
Well, no, I guess because we're coming at this from this perspective of everything is behavioral, and one of the kind of hallmarks of ABA is that there has to be a motivating operation that makes an antecedent more likely to cause a behavior. So if we want a student to sit down and do a math problem, or we want a student to engage in an activity that is math based, I think one of the things that, and I think it's a training thing too. I don't think it's because teachers just don't care. I think it's just a training thing. Is we don't consider what the motivation is for that individual student to actually sit down and engage in that activity. And that motivation may just be accessing kind of immediate reinforcement after the activity is over. But I think
we assume motivation. So I think of like, you know, when we would plan task and I'd be like, oh, okay, so I'm going to put fear. I know this group of girls loves fairy princesses. And, you know, I know not to try to be like gendered. Like, I'm just saying like Miss Hazelwood was known as the unicorn crazy cat lady.
So cute.
So I just had a following. Like I had
Right.
a following. So I just knew like I'm gonna put a group of unicorns on there and like we would see what happened. But again, like, is that motivating? Probably not. So I think, I don't know. Yes, Ted.
The way a lot of the world works and the way that like learning for most of our students works is that early on, getting it wrong is conditioned just by how stuff works out, is conditioned as a punisher. Getting it right itself becomes a conditioned reinforcer.
Mhm.
And those tasks that the student avoids, those tasks where there's like, you know, transition problems, he refuses to quit doing that and do that, you know, there's probably a lot of failure there. There's not a whole lot of getting it right there. And, you know, I'm not at all suggesting that we make sure the kid gets it right every time. We need the right level of difficulty, but very often, so we need a bunch of yep, but we also need to teach that this is getting more difficult behavior to function as a conditioned reinforcer. And again, that's part of what I do when I'm doing the academic remediation, you know, as I present progressively more difficult stuff. It's like, 7 easy ones and 3 a little bit more difficult ones. Well, because those 3 a little bit more difficult ones are embedded in 7 easy ones. It's not, here's your easy ones, now here's your hard ones. But they're embedded in it. The motivation stays up because it's yes, 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 work on it, yes, yes, work on it. But what the student's experiencing then is that this is getting more difficult feeling. At the same time, he's getting stuff right.
Yep.
And so they're impairing that feeling with reinforcement. So even that this is getting more difficult feeling comes to function as a reinforcer. And that we call a challenge. You know, that's when challenges get, you know, that more interesting. That's when you don't pick the easier one. That's when you're going to run 2 miles instead of 1 mile. You know, that's when you accomplish that, things get a whole lot better.
Yeah. I like the way you just said that, because thinking back on it, it's like, you know, I don't know, Paula, you're probably with me because you seem like the type of person that spends hours finding cute images and you're like, oh, the kids are going to love this until they, you know, rip it to shreds and your heart's broken. But I think, yeah, you know, maybe we need to stop thinking so hard, and where Ted's saying, you know, where we're putting the cute images thinking this is motivating, and it's like, no, success is motivating for us all, right, Ted? Am I summing that up right?
Yeah, well, and then you get it done, and then you get to do something fun for a while.
Yeah.
That's where you spend your time looking for things. You spend your time teaching well, so the kid gets stuff right a lot, and the more difficult stuff he works on, and most of the time he gets right, and sometimes he doesn't, and you correct that, and he gets it right, and then he moves on. But then you put the, you know, your other time that you're spending now looking for, you know, koosh balls and other things to throw at the kid when he says 4, when you say what's 2 + 2. Instead, that's when the kid has goofing around time, or that's when it's do whatever you want time, or that's when it's choose a book to look at time.
Yeah, I love that. Work smarter, not harder.
Yep.
There we go.
I think of you whenever I hear that also, Kate.
Hey, Kathy Dillard, my mentor teacher, taught me that. And I was like, I don't understand what that means. I've only worked harder. And then she showed me, I was like, oh, this is smarter. God.
Yeah, I try to keep that in my head. I hear you when I think about it, I hear your voice.
So when Paula was talking about like some of the behavioral goals she had, the one we see it a lot when we go into classrooms and we're brought into consult is the student will sit engaged in a task, and that's where I cycle back around to what's their motivation to do it, right? Like what and while we would hope that all students are there to want to learn, I don't think that is an intrinsic motivator that they come in with. Now, I do think what Ted's saying is true. I think that kids can be taught to see success as a reinforcer, but it has to be taught, just like anything else has to be taught. And they have to access it on a thick schedule and really, you know, see the benefits of it. So,
you know,
but I do think.
Just to kind of touch like on some of those things, some of the behavior goals like always irritate me because I don't know what it looks like. Does that make sense? Yeah. So it's like when someone says, the student will sit. Okay, well, I know some kids that like to sit on to me, it looks painful, but they like sit on their shins, or they like sit with like a leg up. Like I'm trying to do it here. And, but when they sit, like I see them sitting like that, I see them working, they're getting it correct, you know, like, but then like I see teachers fighting, you're electing to be on the floor. You're like, and I'm like, why? Like,
it's like when you're at home working or on something, or if you're studying, like,
I just kind of think about some of the, like, and I think, you know, that's kind of the background, you know, we put these goals in there, but we don't define them. And so it's like, you know, I don't know. That's something that's always bothered me because I come in and even as a teacher, I was like, I don't know what sitting looks like to the previous teachers. Like to me, sitting's, if you need to sit with your bottom on the chair, fine. If it's your shins, fine. Like, I don't know.
And I think as a gen ed teacher, I think you would be more successful with helping your students meet those goals with being flexible, like you're saying, you know, they need to stand up if they need a moment. We had one student who, you know, when he was done, he was just done, and he would just like get his backpack and walk out the door. So we we created you know what, if you need a moment, hold up a red card. We'll say, okay, we actually brought a beanbag chair in for him. You know, we'll set the timer. you know, go ahead, get yourself together. And it worked for him. It doesn't work for everybody, I'm sure, but it worked for him. And then, you know, he would get up when that timer went off, and he would go and sit back down. Or if he needed just a break, you know, one of us would take him out, just take a walk, come back in. Not every teacher's going to do that. They want you sitting, they want your feet on the floor.
And that's the big thing.
It just doesn't work.
Well, and I think it's important to note that you actually timed it. And so a lot of teachers hear, oh, well, you know, they have a break card, they go to their break, and you forget about it because you know, you've negatively reinforced yourself because you can focus on your other kids and that kid's fine over here. So that timer piece is really important. And that's probably why I was successful. And so, you know, things like that aren't taught to teachers. And so
and that's what I'm saying. I learned that from the special ed teacher that was in my class this year. I never would have thought of that.
And also the hard
wonderful.
way. And also the hard way when
Wow,
you're
you're
like, and they're like, no, I'm not.
Yeah, exactly. Like, oh, what have I done? Yeah, right.
But
It has to be taught. Yeah.
Going back to what Kate said about the sitting and the behavioral goals, I think the thing that frustrates me is they're not defined in terms of what their purpose is, what the outcome is. Why is the kid sitting? Well, they're sitting so that they can engage in the activity. And we instill that so young. I mean, how many times have all of us walked into a kindergarten class and behavior actually be created because you have this kid that's sitting on the carpet, but they're not sitting crisscross applesauce.
Yeah.
And the whole instruction is interrupted to prompt that kid to sit crisscross, even though they're sitting and receiving instruction and doing what the functional, you know, what the purpose of being on the carpet is, which is to participate in that kind of choral activity. But all that's being interrupted for the topography of them sitting crisscross applesauce. And kindergarten's really the only grade that you ever do that, right? So like we spend so much time trying to instill that.
Yeah,
And then we move on, and now we're trying to sit in
you
the
break things, and you have to get surgery, and sitting crisscross applesauce is really uncomfortable.
yeah, exactly.
It's hard.
But I think, Kate, in line with what you're saying, and Paul, what I would encourage you is when you have your voice in IEP meetings is, okay, well, if this is the behavioral goal, is it for them to, what is the actual thing that we're going to reinforce? And to me, it's not just sitting. To me, it is the completion of the activity. It's the activity that they're doing. So the way it looks isn't really as relevant as the outcome.
Yeah.
What do you want to say?
And if not, completion's great for most people, but for some, I would just look for doing a little bit better than you did yesterday.
Yeah.
Participating a little more than you did yesterday, sitting a little longer than you did yesterday. I think we all agree the absolute wrong way to do it, worst way to do it is teach the kid to sit for 15 minutes. When he sits for 15 minutes, then he demonstrates he's able to participate in instruction. Maria and I were consulting in a classroom where things were just absolutely toxic. No fault of the teachers. He was dropped in last minute, and Chad, I think you know which classroom this is.
I did.
And
Yeah.
lots of crazy toxic stuff going on. And this guy's doing the best he can. And his goal was get them to sit. When they sit, then we'll teach. And Maria and I didn't want to say, no, you're wrong, because he heard that a lot. So we just started quietly teaching kids stuff and using a lot of really cool reinforcement so that they would stay with us longer and sit with us. And then he noticed this and started doing it too. Sometimes you just lead by example there. But sitting itself is never the goal, unless maybe it's physical therapy you're working on and you're building trunk strength. But even then, you need a reason to sit.
In classrooms, we ask kids to do that a lot. And one of the things that I'm always kind of looking at is how much downtime kids actually have, whether it be in a gen ed class or a special education classroom. Because that really speaks to, like, if they're not doing something, if they're not engaged in something, then they're probably going to find something to engage themselves in. And that particular teacher, when I went into that classroom that you're referring to, Ted, with Maria, was, I told him what he needed to do was, instead of focusing on how long the kids could sit or getting them to sit, is find out how long they could sit doing something they enjoy, because that's really his instructional window for the rest of the kids.
Yeah.
Because while they're occupied doing something, then you can teach this group, and while that group's occupied doing something, then you can teach this group, or you may have to do it even more individually. Katie, you raising your hand after modeling.
I raised my hand because Ted modeled it and he's leading by example.
And you imitated
so
it. You didn't model it. You imitated it.
I did imitate it. You're right. So I have to jump off, right?
You do. Yeah.
To see a sweet child. Yeah. So
Yes,
to
you
do
do.
our
That's
job.
right.
All right. So because it ends it for everybody, doesn't it?
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
So let's,
Sorry, everybody.
Paula, thank you so much for joining us today. It's a lot of fun. We got to get together and have lunch sometime. I
Oh, yeah.
haven't seen you in so
Definitely.
long.
Yeah.
And
When you
next
finish
week is going to
traveling,
be our,
that is. I don't know when you're going to
yeah,
get back.
I'll be home
I don't know.
this weekend. So
Another fun
next
chat
week, I
with
think
you
is going to be
guys.
our last week we're going to take a break off for the month of July and then come back in
Oh.
August. Yeah. But next week we're going to talk about like myths in special education. So that should be fun.
Yeah.
So,
Fun.
Okay.
Thanks everyone.
I'll
for
be
all right,
watching.
everybody.
Thank you.
Thank
I'll be
everyone.
All right,
watching.
awesome.
Bye.
Spread the word.
Bye.
Tell your principal we need to come in for a training.
Yes.
Bye.
I'm your girl.
All right, everybody.
Okay.
You're